My son handed me his adopted daughter's torn backpack with a quick smile. "She will be fine with you for the weekend," he said, claiming they were taking their biological son on a cheap road trip for a soccer tournament. He peeled out of my driveway before she even reached my porch. 10 minutes later, my iPad chimed with a photo of them boarding a luxury cruise, bragging about a $27,000 VIP getaway for their, quote, real family. But the child he abandoned on my doorstep carried a secret in that broken backpack. A secret that would give me the power to dismantle their perfect lives down to the studs. My name is Frank. I am 68 years old, and for 40 years I made my living pulling heavy-duty diesel engines apart and putting them back together. I live in a quiet suburb just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. My hands are permanently stained with the decades of oil and grease, the kind that never really washes out no matter how hard you scrub with pumice soap. I am a gruff man, or so folks tell me, but I loved my wife fiercely. When I lost her 5 years ago, the silence in my house became a heavy living thing. But you learn to carry it. You learn to wake up, drink your coffee, and keep your hands busy. A mechanic knows that when something breaks, you do not just throw it away. You find the cracked seal, you replace the stripped gears, and you rebuild it stronger. I thought I knew how to fix anything. But you cannot use a wrench to fix a man's character, especially when that man is your own flesh and blood. Greg is my only son. He is 38 now. When he was a boy, he used to sit in my garage on an overturned milk crate, watching me rebuild massive Peterbilt transmissions. He used to ask questions, hand me tools, and talk about the kind of hard-working man he wanted to be. Somewhere along the line, the grease and the honest work stopped being enough for him. He went to college, got a degree in marketing, and met Brenda. Brenda is 36, and she measures a person's worth by the brand of their car and the zip code of their address. I never judged her out loud. I smiled at their wedding, I paid for the rehearsal dinner, and I tried to be the father my son needed. 4 years ago, they decided to adopt. Brenda made a massive production out of it. Her social media was flooded with posts about opening their hearts and their home. That is how Lily came into our lives. Lily is 8 years old now, a sweet, quiet girl with large brown eyes that always seem to be apologizing for taking up space. But once the social media likes faded, the reality of raising a child set in, and Brenda's true nature showed its teeth. Lily was no longer a prop. She was an inconvenience, especially compared to their 10-year-old biological son, Hunter. Hunter got the new clothes, the private sports camps, and the endless praise. Lily got the hand-me-downs and the cold, impatient sighs. It was a Friday evening. The sky was bruising into a deep, stormy purple, and the air was thick with humidity. I was sitting on my front porch wiping down a set of socket wrenches when Greg's leased luxury SUV sped into my driveway. The tires crunched harshly against the gravel. The engine was still running when the back door opened. Lily stepped out. She was wearing a faded denim jacket that was too thin for the evening chill. Greg stepped out of the driver's side, popped the trunk, and grabbed a cheap, brightly colored backpack. The zipper was broken, held together by a safety pin. He did not walk her to the door. He did not give her a hug. He just handed her the bag and gave me a tight, hurried wave from across the yard. "Hey, Dad!" Greg called out, his voice loud over the hum of the engine. "Thanks for doing this on such short notice. We are taking Hunter down to a regional soccer tournament in Georgia. Just a budget weekend road trip for the boys, you know, staying at a cheap motel. Lily will be fine with you. We will be back late Sunday." Before I could even stand up to ask a question, Brenda rolled down the passenger window. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses despite the fading light. She did not even look at Lily. She just looked at her phone. "Bye, Lily." Brenda said, her tone as flat and dismissive as if she were talking to a stray dog she had just shooed off her porch. "Be good for your grandfather." Greg jumped back into the driver's seat. The SUV reversed out of my driveway so fast It kicked up a spray of loose rocks. I watched the red taillights disappear around the bend. I stood there on the porch with my grease-stained rag in one hand. I looked down at Lily. She was clutching that torn backpack to her chest, staring at the empty driveway. Her little shoulders were slumped, and she looked so incredibly small against the backdrop of my front yard. "Come on inside, Ladybug," I said, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage. "Let us get you out of the cold. Grandpa has some of those marshmallows you like, the little ones." She followed me into the house without a word. She took her shoes off by the door and placed them perfectly parallel against the baseboard. That broke my heart a little. An 8-year-old child should not be that terrified of making a mess. She tiptoed into the kitchen and sat at the old wooden table. I turned on the stove and started warming up some milk. I did not use the powdered stuff. I took my time stirring real cocoa and a pinch of sugar into the milk, watching the steam rise. I wanted to give her a moment to breathe, to feel safe. I set the mug down in front of her. The steam curled around her face, but she did not reach for it. She just stared at her own reflection in the dark liquid. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. So I said, trying to sound cheerful, "Just you and me this weekend. We can order pizza tonight. Whatever kind you want. Even the one with the pineapple, though. I still say that is a crime against nature." Lily forced a small, polite smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "Thank you, Grandpa." I was about to ask her about school when my iPad, resting on the kitchen counter, let out a sharp chime. It was a notification. I normally ignore the thing, but the screen lit up with a photo. I reached over and grabbed the tablet. It was an Instagram notification from Brenda's public account. She posted everything publicly obsessed with building some kind of influencer lifestyle brand. I tapped the screen. The image loaded, and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. It was not a cheap motel in Georgia. It was not a budget road trip for a youth soccer tournament. The photo showed Greg, Brenda, and Hunter standing on the sun-drenched deck of a massive cruise ship. The location tag clearly read Port of Miami. They were dressed in crisp, expensive resort wear. Greg was holding a tropical drink, and Brenda was leaning against the glass railing of what looked like an enormous multi-room private balcony. Hunter was wearing a brand-new designer outfit, smiling widely. The ocean behind them was a brilliant, sparking blue. But the picture was not the worst part. The worst part was the caption Brenda had typed underneath it. I read it once. Then I read it again, my vision tunneling. Boarding the Royal Caribbean for a much-needed $27,000 VIP getaway. Sometimes you just have to spoil your real family. So blessed to have this time with my boys. $27,000. VIP getaway. Real family. The words burned into my retinas. I felt a sudden sickening drop in my stomach. The sheer unadulterated cruelty of it was staggering. They had driven to my house, dumped an 8-year-old girl on my driveway like a bag of unwanted charity donations, lied directly to my face about a budget soccer trip, and then immediately flew to Miami to spend $27,000 on a luxury cruise. And Brenda had the absolute audacity to call the three of them her real family, deliberately excluding the child they had legally adopted. I set the iPad face down on the counter. My heart pounded with a slow, heavy rhythm. I looked back at Lily. She had both hands wrapped around the warm mug, but she was not drinking. Silent tears were rolling down her cheeks, dropping into the hot chocolate one by one. She was trying so hard not to make a sound. She was trying to make herself invisible. "Lily," I said, my voice thick. "What is it, sweetheart? Why are you crying?" She sniffled and wiped her nose with the back of her sleeve. She refused to look up at me. "I am sorry, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You have nothing to be sorry for." I told her, moving my chair closer to hers. Tell me what happened. She swallowed hard, her small chest heaving with a suppressed sob. Mommy told me I was not allowed to go on the big boat. She said the trip was very expensive and I was not good enough to go. She said I talk too much and I ruin their family pictures. She told me if I complained to you, she would send me back to the foster home. The kitchen went absolutely silent. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. But mostly I could hear the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. I looked at my granddaughter trembling in my kitchen, carrying the devastating weight of feeling entirely unwanted. She believed she was a burden. She believed she was flawed. She had rationed her emotions to protect the comfort of the monsters who were supposed to be her parents. Some men get pushed to their limit, and they explode. They yell, they throw things, they act on blind, hot rage. But a man who has spent 4 decades repairing heavy machinery knows that rage is a useless emotion. Anger is just noise. Anger spins the tires and burns the clutch. What you need is torque. Torque is quiet. Torque is low and steady. Torque is the raw, unyielding power that moves mountains and crushes anything foolish enough to stand in its way. I did not yell. I did not swear. I simply reached across the table and took Lily's small, trembling hands in my own calloused ones. "Look at me, Lily," I said. My voice was completely calm, grounded in an absolute unbreakable certainty. She slowly raised her head. Her brown eyes were wide and filled with tears. "You are not going to any foster home," I told her. "You are my granddaughter. You are perfectly good enough. You are smart and you are kind and you are loved. Your mother lied to you, and she is going to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you treat my family like garbage. Do you understand me?" She gave a tiny, hesitant nod. "Good," I said, letting go of her hands and tapping the mug. "Now drink your hot chocolate. We have a big weekend ahead of us." I watched her take a sip, the tension slowly beginning to drain from her shoulders. I sat back in my chair, staring at the torn backpack resting on the floor near the hallway. I did not know it yet, but that flimsy, broken bag held the exact tools I would need to dismantle my son's life. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could discard an innocent child and sail off into the sunset without consequence. They forgot who raised them. They forgot that I know how to completely disassemble a machine, lay all its dirty, broken parts out on a concrete floor, and ensure it never runs again. Greg and Brenda were enjoying their champagne on a VIP balcony in Miami. But their luxury vacation was about to become the most expensive mistake of their pathetic lives. I was going to strip their fake, perfect world down to the foundation, and I was going to make sure they had absolutely nothing left by the time I was finished. I led Lily up the wooden stairs to the 2nd floor of my house. The floorboards creaked under my boots, a familiar sound that usually brought me comfort, but tonight it just felt heavy. I guided her toward the guest bedroom. It was the room my late wife used to keep perfectly pristine for visitors, with its floral quilt and soft yellow walls. I told Lily I was going to run a warm bath for her down the hall, and that she could use all the extra bubbles she wanted. A tiny, fragile nod was all she gave me. She stood in the center of the room, still clutching that cheap, brightly colored backpack against her chest like a shield. I knelt down to her eye level and gently asked if I could take the bag so I could lay out her pajamas. She hesitated for a second, before slowly handing it over. It felt impossibly light. I set the bag on the mattress and unzipped it. The zipper was broken and snagged halfway, forcing me to pry it open with my thumbs. What I saw inside made my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. Brenda had not packed a weekend bag for a child she loved. She had stuffed a sack for a burden she wanted to forget. I pulled out 3 shirts. They were all faded, stained at the collars, and clearly 2 sizes too small. There was a single pair of jeans with a badly frayed hem. I reached in and pulled out a cheap plastic hairbrush. Half the bristles were snapped off, and the handle was cracked. I searched the bottom corners of the bag, looking for a toy, a stuffed animal, a favorite blanket, anything that a mother would pack to comfort an 8-year-old girl spending the weekend away from home. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking collection of rags. I thought about the photo on my tablet. I thought about the designer clothes her biological brother Hunter was wearing on that luxury cruise ship. The contrast was a physical blow to my chest. I reached deep into the very bottom of the backpack to pull out what looked like a crumpled dollar store coloring book. But as I pulled it out, I felt an unexpected weight. Stuck between the back page of the coloring book and the lining of the bag was a thick manila envelope. It was sealed tight. The heavy textured paper felt entirely out of place among the cheap clothes and broken plastic. It had the distinct formal look of bank correspondence or legal files. I stood there in the quiet of the guest bedroom, holding the heavy envelope in my grease-stained hands. It did not take a genius to figure out how this document had ended up in Lily's bag. I could picture the scene perfectly. Brenda was always reckless when she was in a rush. She lived her life for appearances, always rushing to look perfect for the outside world, while her actual home life was a chaotic mess. I imagined her in her pristine, overpriced kitchen earlier that afternoon, frantic and running late for their flight to Miami. She must have been sweeping the clutter off her marble countertops to make the house look spotless before they left. In her haste to hide her messy piles of mail, she must have grabbed a stack of papers and shoved them into the nearest open bag just to get them out of sight. That bag happened to be Lily's broken backpack. It was a sloppy, arrogant mistake. The kind of catastrophic error made by a person who is so consumed with their own vanity that they become entirely blind to their surroundings. She had packed the bag as if she were throwing away household garbage. But in her desperate rush to escape her responsibilities and board that VIP cruise ship, my daughter-in-law had accidentally handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her fake empire. I heard the bathwater running in the hallway bathroom. I called out to Lily, telling her to hop in and get warm, and that I would be right there. I sat down heavily on the edge of the guest bed. The mattress groaned under my weight. My mechanic instincts took over immediately. When a machine breaks down, you do not just guess what went wrong. You find the part that does not belong, you examine it, you open it up, and you figure out exactly what kind of damage it is doing inside the engine block. I slid my thumb under the flap of the manila envelope and broke the seal. The heavy paper tore with a sharp, crisp sound that echoed in the quiet room. I tipped the envelope upside down and pulled out a thick stack of folded documents. The very first page was a certified court decree from a county court over in Kentucky. I wiped my hands on my jeans, afraid of smudging the ink, and started to read. It took my tired eyes a minute to parse through the dense legal language, but the core facts were undeniable. Lily's biological grandmother, a woman I had never met or even heard about, had passed away a little over a year ago. The document stated that her entire estate had been liquidated by the courts. The grandmother had left behind a massive, irrevocable trust fund. I scanned my finger down to the bottom of the page, tracing the bold black ink. $450,000. The number jumped off the paper and punched me in the throat. $450,000. The decree specifically stated that this massive sum of money was placed in a highly protective trust exclusively for Lily's benefit. The legal mandate was crystal clear. The funds were legally bound to be used solely for her care, her higher education, her future housing, and her medical needs. It was an absolute safety net. It was a beautiful, selfless final gift from a dying woman who desperately wanted to make sure her bloodline was protected and cherished long after she was gone. My hands began to shake. The tremors were not from age, nor were they from the cold. They were from the sudden, suffocating weight of the truth. $450,000. My son had never mentioned a single word about this inheritance to me. Not a whisper. He had hidden a life-changing fortune belonging to his adopted daughter. I turned the court decree over and found a thick stack of official bank statements clipped underneath it. They were the monthly ledgers for the trust account managed by a prominent wealth management bank downtown. I started reading the line items starting from the statement dated 8 months ago. The first few months showed the full balance sitting untouched, quietly gathering interest as it was supposed to. Then, in early September, the withdrawals began. It started with a single wire transfer for $5,000. I checked the routing number on the destination account. It was a direct match to Greg and Brenda's personal joint checking account. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. A month later, there was another transfer. $10,000 this time. Then another $8,000 just before Christmas. Then $12,000 in February. I tracked every single fraudulent transaction with my finger, feeling my stomach violently turn with every line. They were bleeding this little girl dry. They were committing calculated, undeniable felony wire fraud. They were siphoning the money a traumatized orphan needed for her future so they could fund their own lavish lifestyle. They were using a child's safety net to buy designer clothes and lease luxury cars. My eyes scanned down to the very last page. It was the most recent bank statement printed just 3 days ago. There at the bottom of the ledger was a massive single-wire transfer out of Lily's trust fund. The amount was exactly $27,000. The recipient listed on the transaction was Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines. The air in the bedroom grew thick and heavy. The silence was deafening. My own son. My own flesh and blood. The boy I had raised to know right from wrong. He had stolen $27,000 from the abandoned child he swore in a court of law to love and protect, just so he could drink expensive champagne on a private balcony with his real family. They were robbing a defenseless 8-year-old girl so they could play rich for the internet. It was a betrayal so pure, so deep, and so meticulously calculated that it defied human comprehension. They had dropped her off at my house with a broken hairbrush and shirts that did not fit while they sailed across the ocean on her inheritance. I sat on the edge of that bed for a very long time. The initial grief I felt for my son the morning for the boy I used to know burned away completely. It evaporated into absolute nothingness. What replaced it was a cold, terrifying clarity. A younger, more foolish man would have thrown that stack of papers across the room. He would have punched a hole straight through the drywall. He would have called his son on the phone, screaming and cursing into the receiver, demanding answers, and letting hot rage take the wheel. But I did not yell. I did not break anything. I knew that losing my temper would only give them a warning. A mechanic knows that if you strike a seized bolt with a hammer in a blind panic, you will only strip the metal and ruin your chances of removing it. You do not force it. You apply steady, calculated pressure. You apply torque. I carefully folded the bank statements and the court decree back along their original creases. I slid them back into the heavy manila envelope and tucked it safely inside the inner pocket of my heavy denim jacket. I zipped the broken backpack shut and pushed it under the bed. I walked into the hallway bathroom and handed Lily a fluffy, warm towel. I helped her get into a clean, oversized t-shirt of mine that swallowed her small frame like a giant protective hug. I guided her back to the guest bed and tucked her in. I pulled the heavy floral blankets all the way up to her chin, making sure she was warm. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. Her breathing was already starting to slow down. The sheer emotional exhaustion of feeling unwanted and abandoned was finally giving way to the heavy pull of sleep. I looked at her sweet, innocent face resting on the pillow, completely unaware of the massive fortune she owned and completely unaware of the monsters who were trying to steal it from her. "You are safe now, Ladybug," I whispered in the dark. I turned off the bedside lamp and quietly walked out of the room, leaving the door cracked just enough to let a sliver of hallway light shine through. I walked downstairs, moving with a mechanical, deliberate purpose. I opened the back door and stepped out into my garage. I reached up and pulled the chain to turn on the overhead fluorescent lights. They hummed and flickered to life, casting a harsh, bright glow over my heavy steel workbenches and tool chests. The familiar smells of motor oil, sawdust, and cold metal filled my lungs, grounding me in reality. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady now. The time for sorrow had passed. It was time to make a midnight phone call. It was time to stop fixing broken things and start completely dismantling a fake life. The weekend passed with a quiet, heavy peace. I spent Saturday and Sunday making sure Lily felt like the most important person in the world. We baked pancakes from scratch. We planted a small tomato garden in the backyard. For 2 days, I refused to look at my phone. I refused to look at the photos of my son smiling on a luxury cruise ship. I focused entirely on the little girl who was currently sleeping in my spare room. But when Monday morning arrived, the soft and comforting grandfather disappeared, and the mechanic went to work. I woke up at 5 in the morning. The house was completely silent. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at the thick manila envelope resting on the wood. Inside that envelope was the blueprint of my son's destruction. I packed Lily a proper lunch. Fresh fruit, a good turkey sandwich, and a little note that said, "Grandpa loves you." I drove her to the local elementary school. When she hopped out of my truck, she turned back and gave me a wave. Her smile was small, but it was genuine. I waited until she walked safely through those double glass doors. The second she was out of sight, my blood ran absolutely cold. The time for patience was over. It was 8 in the morning, and I had an appointment downtown. I merged onto the highway, heading straight for Gay Street in downtown Knoxville. The morning traffic was dense, filled with commuters rushing to start their work weeks. I kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel. I thought about the 40 years I spent covered in engine grease, breaking my back to make sure Greg had everything he needed to succeed. I paid for his college tuition. I paid for his wedding. I gave him every possible advantage so he would never have to struggle the way I did when I was young. And how did he repay that lifetime of sacrifice? By stealing from a defenseless orphan to buy tropical drinks on a boat. I pulled into a parking garage on Gay Street. The air down here was different. It was sharp, expensive, and professional. I grabbed the manila envelope from the passenger seat and walked 2 blocks to a tall, imposing brick building. I walked through the heavy glass doors and took the elevator to the 4th floor. I stepped into a waiting room that smelled of polished leather and expensive coffee. The receptionist asked for my name. I told her I was Frank, and I was there to see Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn Hayes was not a cheap lawyer. She was a 55-year-old no-nonsense family law and financial litigation attorney. A buddy of mine from the heavy-duty repair shop had used her during a vicious custody dispute a decade ago. He told me she was an absolute shark. He said she had never lost a child welfare case in her entire career. That was exactly what I needed. I did not need someone to hold my hand and tell me everything would be okay. I needed a predator who knew exactly how to draw blood in a courtroom. A tall woman with sharp gray eyes and her hair pulled back into a tight bun opened a set of double doors. She wore a dark, tailored suit and carried herself with the kind of rigid authority that demanded absolute respect. She introduced herself as Evelyn Hayes, and invited me into her office. Her workspace was immaculate. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, completely clear of clutter. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from her. I did not waste time with polite small talk. I placed the thick manila envelope directly onto the polished wood of her mahogany desk. "Tell me why you are here, Frank," she said. Her voice was calm, but it held a remarkably sharp edge. I told her the entire story from the beginning. I explained how Greg and Brenda pulled into my driveway on Friday evening. I told her how they dropped Lily off with a broken zipper backpack and hand-me-down clothes that did not even fit her properly. I described the lie my son told me right to my face, claiming they were taking their biological son on a budget road trip for a youth soccer tournament. Then, I pulled out my phone and showed Evelyn the screenshot I had taken of Brenda's public social media account. I showed her the geo-tagged photo at the Port of Miami, the $27,000 VIP getaway, and the vile caption about treating their real family. Evelyn looked at the photo. Her expression did not change, but her eyes grew noticeably colder. She slid the phone back to me and opened the manila envelope. I watched her read through the certified court decree. I watched her trace the lines of the bank statements detailing Lily's $450,000 irrevocable trust fund. I sat in silence as she meticulously examined the withdrawal history. She saw the $5,000 transfers. She saw the $10,000 transfers. She saw the final massive wire transfer of $27,000 sent directly to Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines just 3 days ago. Evelyn laid the papers down flat on her desk. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingertips together. When she finally spoke, her voice was absolute ice. "Voice. Frank," she said, looking me dead in the eye. "What your son and his wife have done here goes far beyond poor parenting. This is not just a family dispute over a vacation. We are looking at a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. By draining this account for their personal luxury expenses, they have committed a massive violation of the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act. And because they wired these funds across state lines to a port in Florida, they have officially crossed the threshold into federal wire fraud." Hearing those words spoken aloud by a legal professional made the reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Federal wire fraud. My son was not just a terrible, neglectful father. He was a federal criminal. He was systematically robbing a child. I want them stopped. I told her, my voice low and steady. I want Lily protected, and I want every single cent of that money put back where it belongs. I want to know exactly how they managed to burn through so much cash in just 8 months. Evelyn did not hesitate. She turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. "Give me their full legal names and the names of any businesses they currently operate," she commanded. I gave her the information. Greg ran a boutique marketing firm, and Brenda owned an upscale women's clothing boutique in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. They always bragged about how well their businesses were doing. They drove luxury cars, wore designer clothes, and threw extravagant dinner parties for their neighborhood friends. I always assumed they were highly successful. I was a mechanic. I knew how to fix engines, not read corporate balance sheets. Evelyn stared at her dual monitors for several long minutes. The only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of her keyboard and the soft hum of the office air conditioning. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the screens as she dug through public records, corporate filings, and financial databases. As I sat there waiting, I thought about the engine of a commercial truck. Sometimes a truck looks beautiful on the outside. The paint is waxed, the chrome is polished, and it looks like $1 million rolling down the highway. But if you open the hood and look close enough, you might find that the transmission is totally shot. The oil is leaking into the coolant, and the whole thing is just one steep hill away from a catastrophic failure. People are exactly the same way. Greg and Brenda spent all their time polishing their chrome, making sure everyone in their wealthy social circle thought they were perfect. But underneath the hood, they were completely broken. Evelyn finally stopped typing. She let out a long, heavy sigh and turned one of her monitors around so I could see the screen. It was covered in red numbers, legal notices, and financial graphs that meant very little to my untrained eyes. But I did not need to be an accountant to understand the look of grim satisfaction on Evelyn's face. "Your son and daughter-in-law are not successful business owners, Frank," said, her tone dripping with professional disgust. "They are drowning. They are financially suffocating, and they have been using this little girl as their personal life raft." She pointed to a section of the screen detailing Brenda's upscale clothing boutique. "Brenda's business is completely underwater," Evelyn explained. "The boutique has not turned a legitimate profit in over 2 years. She is 6 months behind on her commercial lease. Her inventory suppliers have filed 3 separate civil suits for unpaid invoices. She has maxed out every line of corporate credit available to her. The only reason the doors are still open is because she has been quietly injecting stolen cash from Lily's trust fund into the business account to cover the rent and keep up appearances." I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach. She was stealing a child's future to sell overpriced dresses to rich housewives. "And what about Greg?" asked, almost dreading the answer. Evelyn clicked her mouse, pulling up a new set of documents. "Greg is in even worse shape," she continued. "His marketing firm lost its 2 biggest clients last spring. He has been taking out high-interest short-term loans just to cover his own payroll, but that is not where the bulk of the money is going." She highlighted a series of recurring transactions. "Greg and Brenda are obsessed with maintaining the illusion of upper-middle-class wealth," Evelyn said, her voice filled with a cold, righteous anger. "They are bleeding this little girl dry to pay for the lease on that luxury SUV they drove to your house. They are using her inheritance to pay the membership fees at their exclusive country club. They are using a dead woman's final gift to buy designer clothes, throw lavish parties, and take $27,000 VIP cruises, all so their wealthy neighbors will not realize they are actually flat broke." The sheer magnitude of their deception was staggering. They were living a complete lie. Every smile, every expensive outfit, every brag about their successful lives was funded by the systematic robbery of an innocent 8-year-old girl. They had adopted Lily so Brenda could post pictures on the internet and look like a saint. Then when the grandmother passed away and left behind that massive trust fund, they saw Lily not as a daughter, but as a bank account. They discarded her like trash at my house, so she would not ruin their perfect family photos on a vacation paid for entirely by her own money. I looked at Evelyn. The anger inside me was no longer a hot, chaotic flame. It had condensed into a cold, hard block of solid steel. I had spent my entire life working hard, playing by the rules, and providing for my family. I had raised my son to understand the value of an honest dollar. To find out that he had mutated into a greedy, shallow parasite who would exploit an orphan to maintain a fake social status was the greatest failure of my life. But I was going to fix it. "Can we prove all of this?" I asked her. "Can we prove that the money they spent on that cruise and those cars came directly from the trust fund?" Evelyn offered a tight, dangerous smile. The kind of smile a shark gets right before it bites the cage. "Frank," she said, leaning forward, "financial crimes are the easiest crimes to prove if you know exactly where to look. They were arrogant. They were sloppy. They wired funds directly from a protected trust into a personal checking account and then used that exact same checking account to pay the cruise line. It leaves a paper trail a mile wide and a mile deep. The forensic accounting on this will take my team less than 48 hours to completely map out." I took a deep breath. The air in the office felt cool and clean. "What is our first move?" I asked. "We move on multiple fronts simultaneously," Evelyn answered, her eyes locking onto mine. "First, we secure the child. I am going to draft an emergency petition for temporary custody based on imminent financial abuse and supervisory neglect. I will have a judge sign it before the courts close today. Lily stays with you. They do not get to come within 100 yards of her." I nodded. "And the money?" I asked. Evelyn picked up her pen and tapped it against the mahogany desk. "I am going to contact the bank and freeze the remainder of the trust fund immediately. Then I am preparing a comprehensive dossier of their financial transactions. Because they crossed state lines with the wired funds, this is a federal matter. We are not just going to sue them in civil court, Frank. We are turning this over to the federal authorities. They are going to face criminal indictments." The words hung in the air. Criminal indictments. My son was going to face federal charges. A part of me, the soft, fatherly part that remembered him as a little boy in my garage, felt a sudden pang of grief. But I crushed it instantly. That little boy was gone. The man who had taken his place was a monster who locked a traumatized child out of her own life to steal her future. He deserved no mercy, and I was going to offer none. "Do it!" I said, my voice unwavering. "Do whatever it takes. I do not care how much it costs. I do not care how long it takes. I want you to freeze their accounts. I want you to secure my granddaughter. And I want you to drag all their dirty secrets out into the broad daylight for the whole world to see." Evelyn Hayes nodded slowly, opening a fresh legal pad. "Consider it done, Frank," she said. "Let us get to work." I sat back in the heavy leather chair and watched the shark on Gay Street begin to tear my son's fake life to shreds. The engine of justice had been fired up and I was ready to let it run hot. Evelyn and I were sitting in the quiet of her downtown office when the heavy oak door slowly creaked open. Her paralegal walked into the room. He was a sharp young man carrying a thick stack of freshly printed papers. He did not say a single word to me. He just walked straight to the mahogany desk, placed the massive stack of documents right in front of Evelyn, and tapped the top page with his index finger. He gave his boss a look that instantly made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I have spent 40 years working in heavy-duty diesel repair shops. I know the exact look a mechanic gives you when he drops an oil pan and finds a handful of shredded metal shavings sitting at the bottom. It is the undeniable look of catastrophic failure. The young man quietly backed out of the room and shut the door behind him, leaving us in a heavy, suffocating silence. Evelyn picked up the stack of papers. For 5 long minutes, she read through the documents without making a sound. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the pages. Her jaw tightened. Her posture grew incredibly stiff. The professional, calculated composure she had maintained just moments ago seemed to fracture, replaced by a look of genuine, deep-seated disgust. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock and the low, steady hum of the air conditioning vent overhead. My grease-stained hands rested heavy on my knees. I consider myself a very patient man, but the absolute silence in that room was starting to gnaw at my bones. I could feel my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Finally, Evelyn let out a long, exhausted sigh and dropped the papers flat onto her desk. She looked across the table at me, and her eyes held a kind of sympathetic pity that I absolutely despised. "Frank," she started, her voice noticeably lower and much more serious than before. "When my firm takes on a case involving financial fraud within a family unit, my team performs a comprehensive asset sweep. We look at every associated business, every joint checking account, and every piece of real estate tied to the primary suspects. We have to know exactly what kind of financial landscape we are dealing with before we go to a judge." I nodded slowly, telling her that I understood the procedure. She reached out and turned her laptop screen around, so it faced me directly. She pointed to a scanned legal document displayed brightly on the monitor. "I want you to look at this very carefully," she told me. "My paralegal just pulled the county property records on your primary residence. He pulled the deed to the house you currently live in. The exact same house your son dropped Lily off at on Friday evening. I leaned forward in my leather chair, squinting at the glowing screen. I was deeply confused. I did not understand why we were looking at documents regarding my personal property. I bought that house 35 years ago. My late wife and I worked ourselves to the absolute bone to pay off that 30-year mortgage. I took endless overtime shifts in the dead of winter, freezing my hands on icy engine blocks, just to make sure we sent extra money to the bank every single month. We owned that house free and clear by the time Greg was a sophomore in high school. That house was my sanctuary. It was the place where my wife planted her beautiful rose bushes, where we hosted decades of family holidays, and where she eventually took her final breaths. That modest house was my entire life. It was the only tangible thing I had left of her memory. Evelyn pointed to a bold line of text near the top of the digital document. "Frank," she said gently. 6 months ago, a massive home equity line of credit was taken out, using your property as the sole collateral. Your home was fully leveraged for a bank loan of $350,000. The primary borrower listed on this loan agreement is your son, Greg. The money was disbursed directly into the failing operating account of his marketing firm. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. $350,000. A home equity line of credit. I stared blankly at the screen, completely unable to process the numbers my eyes were reading. The room started to spin. My lungs felt incredibly tight, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the office. I told Evelyn there had to be some kind of massive clerical mistake. I told her my house was completely paid off. I explained that I never went to a bank, I never sat down with a loan officer, and I absolutely never put my family home up as collateral for Greg's failing business. I would never risk the roof over my head. Not for Greg. Not for anybody. Evelyn slowly slid a printed copy of the final signature page across the mahogany desk. She placed it right in front of me. "I know you did not sign this document, Frank," she said, her voice filling with a cold, hard anger. "Because the signature on this dotted line is a complete forgery. I want you to look closely at it." I looked down at the crisp white piece of paper. There on the bottom line was my name. But it was not my handwriting. It was a remarkably good copy, but a man knows his own signature. The loops on the letters were far too clean. The pressure of the pen was far too even. My hands have been battered and broken by decades of swinging heavy wrenches and lifting transmission blocks. My signature is rough sharp and a little jagged. The signature on that bank document was smooth, steady, and heavily practiced. I realized with a sickening, terrifying clarity exactly what had happened. Greg had practiced forging my name. My own son. The boy I patiently taught how to hold a pencil. The boy I sat with at the kitchen table every night, helping with spelling homework, had sat down at a desk and meticulously practiced forging his father's name so he could steal my home. I looked up at Evelyn, my vision blurring with a toxic mixture of profound grief and rapidly escalating rage. "What does this mean?" I asked her, my voice trembling despite my absolute best efforts to keep it steady. Evelyn did not sugarcoat the reality. She gave it to me straight, exactly like I needed to hear it. "It means your son committed aggravated identity theft and federal bank fraud," she explained quietly. "It also means that your house currently holds a $350,000 lien against it. I want you to look at the repayment schedule my paralegal pulled up. Greg has not made a single payment on this loan in over 3 months. He is in severe default. If this loan goes into formal foreclosure, the bank will seize your property. They will evict you and auction off your house to recover the stolen funds." The sheer gravity of her words crashed down on me like a collapsing concrete wall. If Greg defaulted on the loan he fraudulently acquired, the bank would take my house. They would take the home my wife and I built with our own blood and sweat. They would take the safe haven I had just promised to provide for little Lily. If the bank seized my property, Lily and I would be thrown out onto the street. We would be completely homeless. The safety net I thought I had, the secure and quiet retirement I broke my back to achieve, was completely gone. It had been gambled away by a greedy, selfish coward who could not face his own financial failures. The secondary betrayal cut infinitely deeper than the first. It was one thing to discover that Greg and Brenda were actively stealing from an abandoned child's trust fund. That alone was an act of unforgivable evil. But to realize that my own son was willing to actively destroy his own father to leave me totally destitute and homeless in my old age just to keep his sinking ship afloat was a level of pure malice I simply could not comprehend. I thought about Greg dropping Lily off in my driveway on Friday evening. I thought about him smiling at me, giving me a cheerful wave goodbye from the comfortable driver's seat of his leased luxury car. He was looking directly at the father whose home he had secretly stolen. He was looking at the father he had knowingly doomed to bankruptcy and homelessness, and he did not even blink. He just smiled, lied directly to my face about a budget soccer tournament, and drove off to the airport without a single care in the world. An image flashed vividly in my mind. It was the Instagram photo Brenda had posted. I pictured Greg standing proudly on the sunny deck of that massive cruise ship, the warm Florida sun hitting his face, a cold glass of expensive champagne resting in his hand. He was toasting to his perfect, wealthy, untouchable life. He was celebrating a $27,000 VIP vacation, and every single drop of that champagne was paid for with the blood of his family. He was literally drinking Lily's future. He was sleeping in a luxury suite funded entirely by the theft of my home. He had placed a ticking time bomb on the roof of my house, handed the detonator over to the bank, and sailed away without a single ounce of remorse or guilt. I looked down at my grease-stained hands resting on my lap. They were shaking violently. But this time it was not from shock. It was not from a place of sadness or mourning. It was from a pure, unadulterated, blinding fury. The heavy grief that had been weighing down my heart completely evaporated in an instant. You cannot mourn a son who does not exist. The man who forged my name, the man who robbed a traumatized child, the man who smiled while he ruined my life was not my son. He was a dangerous parasite. He was an active threat to my survival and a direct threat to my granddaughter's safety. And a mechanic knows exactly how to deal with a severe threat. You do not negotiate with a stripped gear. You do not try to reason with a blown gasket. You cut it out, you discard it, and you replace it with something much stronger. I took a deep, steadying breath. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly crisp and clear. I pressed my hands flat against the cool top of Evelyn's mahogany desk and slowly pushed myself up. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders and lifting my chin. The familiar aches in my joints completely vanished. The weariness of my 68 years disappeared entirely. I felt a massive surge of raw, unstoppable adrenaline course through my veins. I looked down at Evelyn Hayes. She was watching me closely, waiting to see how the old man would react to losing everything he held dear. She was waiting to see if I would finally crumble under the crushing weight of this devastating reality. I did not crumble. I turned to solid stone. "Evelyn," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet office, with a chilling, absolute certainty. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. 2 hours ago, I came in here wanting to stop them from hurting Lily. I just wanted to freeze their accounts and get the little girl's inheritance money back. But the rules of engagement have completely changed." I paused, letting the silence command the room for a brief moment. "I do not just want to save the girl anymore," I told her, holding her sharp gray eyes with my own. I want you to tear their entire fake world apart. I want every fraudulent document exposed to the light. I want every single stolen dollar tracked and recovered. I want the federal authorities breathing down their necks the exact second their luxury cruise ship docks at the port. I want you to dismantle their lives down to the studs. Leave them with absolutely nothing. Evelyn did not waste a single second after we finished reviewing the financial disaster my son had created. She looked at her watch, picked up her heavy leather briefcase, and told me we were going straight to the county courthouse. When a lawyer like Evelyn Hayes tells you it is time to move, you do not ask questions. You just follow her lead. We walked the few blocks down Gay Street toward the courthouse. The morning air in downtown Knoxville was crisp, and the sun was shining brightly against the brick buildings, but I felt like a man walking into a massive storm. I was about to ask a judge to legally strip my own flesh and blood of his parental rights. I was about to declare war on the boy I had raised. A mechanic knows the exact moment a part is beyond repair. You can weld a cracked block, and you can replace a blown seal, but when the metal itself is fatigued to the point of shattering under pressure, you have to throw it in the scrap pile. Greg had shattered. He was no longer my son. He was a threat to an innocent child, and I had to treat him exactly like one. We walked through the metal detectors and took the elevator up to the family court division. The hallways were filled with people carrying their own tragedies. Mothers crying softly on wooden benches, fathers speaking in hushed, angry tones to public defenders. It was a place where broken families came to fight over the pieces. Evelyn did not stop to look at any of them. She marched straight to the clerk's window and demanded an emergency ex parte hearing. For those who do not know the legal jargon, an ex parte hearing means you go before a judge without the other party present. You only get one if there is an immediate catastrophic threat to a child's physical or emotional safety. Evelyn handed the clerk a stack of papers, spoke a few sharp words, and within 20 minutes we were being ushered through a heavy oak door into a private judicial chamber. The judge was an older woman, with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every terrible thing a human being could do to another. She sat behind a massive wooden desk, adjusting her reading glasses as we walked in. Evelyn did not bother with pleasantries. She laid out the entire case with the brutal precision of a surgeon operating on a fatal wound. She explained how Lily had been adopted 4 years ago, strictly as a prop for social media. She detailed how my son and his wife had dropped the 8-year-old girl off at my house with a broken zipper backpack and clothes that were 2 sizes too small, lying straight to my face about a budget soccer tournament. Then Evelyn pulled out the heavy artillery. She placed the certified bank statements directly on the judge's desk. She traced the lines of the irrevocable trust fund left by Lily's late biological grandmother. She showed the judge how Greg and Brenda had systematically drained tens of thousands of dollars over the last 8 months, committing blatant wire fraud to prop up their failing businesses and fund their luxury lifestyle. Finally, Evelyn placed the printed screenshot of Brenda's public Instagram post right on top of the bank ledgers. The photo of my son holding a tropical drink on a $27,000 VIP cruise ship, bragging about treating his real family. I watched the judge's face as she read the caption. I saw the exact moment her professional neutrality vanished. Her jaw tightened, and a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust washed over her features. She looked at the bank statement showing the final withdrawal sent to the cruise line, and then she looked at the smiling faces of the monsters who had stolen it. "This is despicable," the judge whispered, her voice vibrating with a quiet, dangerous anger. They abandoned a traumatized, adopted child to go on a luxury vacation funded entirely by that child's stolen inheritance. Evelyn nodded, standing perfectly straight. "Your Honor, the minor child is in imminent danger of severe emotional neglect and catastrophic financial abuse." The primary suspects are currently outside of the state jurisdiction, out in international waters. I am requesting a temporary emergency custody order granting full physical and legal custody to her grandfather Frank, effective immediately until a formal hearing can be convened with federal authorities. The judge did not even hesitate. She reached for her heavy black pen and signed the bottom of the order with a swift, aggressive stroke. She pressed her official seal onto the paper, making it absolute law. She looked over the desk directly at me. "Mr. Frank," she said, handing me the certified document. "You keep that little girl safe. You do not let those people anywhere near her. The court will ensure that they answer for every single penny they took from her." I took the paper. It felt heavier than a transmission block. "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "I will protect her with my life." Walking out of that courthouse holding the emergency custody order in my grease-stained hands, the cold block of steel in my chest felt permanent. I had the law on my side. I had the power to protect Lily. But I knew that a piece of paper was only as strong as the man holding it. I needed to turn my house into a fortress before those two parasites stepped off their cruise ship. I left Evelyn to handle the federal filings and drove my truck straight to the largest hardware store in the county. A man who works with his hands knows that security is not about relying on someone else to save you. Security is about building physical barriers that cannot be breached. I walked down the aisles with a heavy metal cart, throwing in everything I needed to lock my world down. I bought 4 heavy-duty industrial-grade deadbolts. I bought reinforced steel strike plates and 3-inch deck screws to anchor the doors directly into the framing studs of the house. I also purchased a top-of-the-line high-definition security camera system with night vision motion sensors and continuous cloud recording. I spent over $1,000 swiping my credit card without a single second of hesitation. When I got back to my house in Maple Ridge, I went straight to work. I took my cordless drill and my heavy hammer, and I systematically removed every old lock on my front, back, and garage doors. I installed the new industrial deadbolts, driving the long steel screws deep into the wooden frames so that no one could ever kick those doors open. I mounted the security cameras under the eaves of the roof, angling them to cover the driveway, the front porch, and the backyard. I routed the video feed directly to my phone and my iPad. By the time I was finished, my property was locked down tighter than a bank vault. Greg still had an old spare key to my front door on his keychain, but that key was now completely useless. He would never step foot inside my home again. With the perimeter secure, I turned my attention to the most important task of the day. I walked up the stairs and stood in front of the door to my late wife's sewing room. I had kept that room closed for 5 long years. It still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume and the old cotton fabrics she used to make quilts. Opening that door felt like opening a time capsule of my own grief. But as I looked at her old wooden sewing table and the boxes of forgotten yarn, I knew exactly what my wife would have wanted me to do. She would not have wanted her space to be a dusty museum for the dead. She would have wanted it to be a sanctuary for a child who desperately needed a mother's touch. I rolled up my sleeves and cleared the room entirely. I carefully packed away the sewing machine, the fabrics, and the old photographs, moving them to the attic with the utmost respect. Once the room was completely empty, I drove to the local furniture and department stores. I was on a mission. Lily had lived out of a broken backpack and worn hand-me-downs for 4 years. She had been treated like a second-class citizen in a house dripping with stolen wealth. That ended today. I bought a beautiful solid wood twin bed frame and the most comfortable mattress in the store. I bought soft, high-quality sheets and a thick, fluffy comforter covered in bright pink flowers. I picked out a white wooden dresser, a matching nightstand, and a small desk where she could do her homework in peace. I bought a brand new sturdy backpack with butterflies on it and filled it with fresh notebooks, colored pencils, and markers. I went to the children's clothing section and bought dresses, jeans, sweaters, and pajamas that were actually her size, soft and brand new with the tags still attached. I bought a pair of sneakers that lit up when you walked because I remembered my nieces loving those things. Finally, I bought 3 large, incredibly soft stuffed animals, a bear, a dog, and a giant pink rabbit. I spent the entire afternoon assembling the furniture, making the bed, and hanging up her new clothes in the closet. I set the stuffed animals on the pillows. I plugged in a small, star-shaped nightlight to keep the dark away. I stood in the doorway and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The dusty, sad sewing room was gone. In its place was a beautiful, warm, vibrant bedroom fit for a little princess. It was a room that loudly and clearly communicated one absolute truth. You are wanted here. At 3:00, I drove my truck to the elementary school to pick Lily up. She walked out of the building looking nervous, gripping the straps of her old broken backpack. She climbed into the truck and asked me in a tiny voice if she had been good today. I told her she was always good, and that Grandpa had a huge surprise waiting for her at home. When we walked through the newly reinforced front door, I took her by the hand and led her up the stairs. I stopped in front of the new bedroom. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and gently pushed her inside. Lily stopped dead in her tracks. She stood perfectly still, her big brown eyes scanning the pink floral blankets, the white desk, the closet full of new clothes, and the giant stuffed rabbit waiting on the bed. She dropped her broken backpack on the floor. She turned around and looked up at me, completely bewildered, her lower lip trembling. "Whose room is this, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Is someone else coming to stay with us?" I knelt down on the carpet so I was looking right into her eyes. "Nobody else is coming." "Ladybug," I said, my voice thick with all the emotion I had been holding back all day. "This is your room. These are your clothes. That is your bed. You do not have to sleep in the guest room ever again. This is your home now, and nobody is ever going to make you leave." She stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then she let out a sound that broke my heart and healed it all at once. It was a loud, desperately happy sob. She threw her little arms around my neck and buried her face in my shoulder, crying onto my heavy denim jacket. I wrapped my big, calloused arms around her small frame and held her tight. I closed my eyes and silently made a vow to whatever higher power was listening. Greg and Brenda thought they could throw this child away and sail off into the sunset. They thought they could steal her future and use my house to fund their arrogance, but they were about to come home to a fortified castle guarded by a man who had nothing left to lose. Let them sip their champagne. Let them post their fake smiles on the internet. Because when their luxury cruise docked, they were going to walk straight into a nightmare they could never escape. Tuesday morning brought a heavy gray sky that threatened rain, matching the cold steel feeling sitting dead center in my chest. I drove my truck back downtown to Gay Street, parking in the same concrete garage. I walked into Evelyn Hayes' office at exactly 9:00. She was already waiting for me in her large conference room. Sitting next to her was a thin, quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and a stack of thick ledgers in front of him. Evelyn introduced him as David. She told me David was a forensic accountant, a man who spent his entire career hunting down stolen money for the courts. I shook his hand. His grip was soft, but his eyes were sharp. I took my seat at the heavy mahogany table. I felt exactly like I did when I used to stand in front of a ruined diesel engine, waiting for the diagnostic machine to print out the catastrophic failure codes. I knew it was going to be bad. I just needed to know exactly how deep the rot had spread. David opened the first ledger. He did not use complicated financial jargon. He spoke plainly, pointing to the columns of numbers with a silver pen. He started with the irrevocable trust fund left by Lily's grandmother. $450,000. It was supposed to be locked away, gathering interest to secure that little girl's future. But David showed me the exact date the first crack appeared in the dam. 8 months ago, Greg transferred $5,000 from the trust into his own personal checking account. David slid a printed bank statement across the table to prove it. I stared at my son's name printed next to the stolen funds. David explained that once they realized nobody was actively monitoring the trust, the floodgates opened. The theft became a monthly routine. "Here's where the money actually went." David said, his voice flat and clinical. He pulled up a complex spreadsheet on a large screen at the end of the table. He traced a red line from the trust account directly into the business account for Brenda's upscale clothing boutique. Brenda was 3 months behind on her commercial rent last October, David explained. Her landlord had filed a formal eviction notice. 2 days before the locks were going to be changed on her store, $10,000 was wired from Lily's trust into Brenda's business account. She used an orphan's inheritance to pay her back rent and buy a new shipment of designer shoes so she could pretend her business was booming. My jaw tightened. I thought about Lily wearing hand-me-down shirts that were 2 sizes too small, while the woman who adopted her bought luxury inventory with her stolen money. But Brenda was not the only one drowning. David clicked his mouse and brought up a new set of banking records. These records belonged to Greg. David pointed to a series of automated payments going to a major national bank. "This is the home equity line of credit Greg took out against your house," David said, looking at me with a grim expression. "When his marketing firm lost its biggest contracts, he ran out of cash. He forged your signature to secure a $350,000 loan against your property. But a loan of that size requires massive monthly interest payments. Greg could not afford them, so he started using Lily's trust fund to pay the bank. He was stealing from his daughter to pay for the crime he committed against his father." I sat back in my chair. The sheer mechanics of their betrayal were staggering. They had built a house of cards, and they were using the blood of their own family to hold it together. David was not finished. He pulled up the final, most devastating piece of evidence. It was the wire transfer receipt for $27,000. He tracked the routing numbers directly from the trust account through Greg's checking account and straight into the corporate billing department of Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines. "They booked the absolute highest tier luxury suite available," David said, shaking his head in disgust. "They bought premium drink packages, private excursions, and first-class plane tickets to Miami for themselves and their biological son. Every single penny came from the child they left behind in Knoxville." Evelyn took over the conversation. She closed the ledger and folded her hands on the table. The anger in her eyes was cold and absolute. "Frank," she said, "what David just showed you changes the entire landscape of this legal battle. This is no longer just a family court issue. This is no longer just about securing emergency custody or fighting over a neglected child in a local jurisdiction." She paused, letting the silence command the room. "By transferring that $27,000 from a bank in Tennessee to a corporate port in Miami, Florida, your son crossed state lines," Evelyn explained. "And because the victim of this theft is a minor child protected under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, this officially escalates into a major federal crime." I looked at her, processing the weight of her words. Federal crime. The phrase echoed in my head. "I am not going to simply file a civil lawsuit," Evelyn continued. "I have already drafted a comprehensive airtight dossier containing all of David's forensic accounting, the forged property deeds, and the wire transfer logs. I am quietly submitting this entire package directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." The air in the conference room felt incredibly heavy. Evelyn was telling me that she was handing my only son over to the federal government. She was preparing a trap that would end with federal agents putting Greg and Brenda in handcuffs. I thought about the boy I used to take fishing on Sunday mornings. I thought about the proud feeling I had when he graduated college. But then I thought about Lily. I thought about her sitting at my kitchen table crying into a mug of hot chocolate, believing she was fundamentally broken because her parents had thrown her away like garbage. I thought about my house, the home my late wife had loved so dearly, secretly leveraged and placed on the brink of foreclosure by my own flesh and blood. "Do it," I said. My voice did not shake. It was as solid as a cast-iron engine block. "Submit the dossier to the feds. I want them to face every single consequence of their actions." Evelyn nodded, a fierce spark of respect lighting up her eyes. "The authorities will need time to verify the financial routing and prepare the arrest warrants," she warned me. "The federal government moves methodically. They will let Greg and Brenda finish their luxury cruise. They will let them fly back to Knoxville thinking they got away with everything. We need to maintain absolute silence until the trap snaps shut." "I understand," I replied. "I can play the waiting game." I left Evelyn's office at noon and drove back to Maple Ridge. The sky had cleared up, and the afternoon sun was shining brightly on my driveway. I walked inside my house and locked the newly reinforced steel deadbolts behind me. The house was peaceful. Lily was upstairs in her new pink bedroom, sitting at her desk and drawing in a brand new sketchbook I had bought for her. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her. She looked so small, but the terrible heavy tension that had gripped her shoulders on Friday night was completely gone. She was safe. She was home. I walked down to the kitchen and made myself a simple sandwich. I sat at the table and opened my iPad to review the security camera feeds. The perimeter of my house was totally secure. Nothing could get in without me knowing about it. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Greg. He was currently floating somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, drinking tropical cocktails paid for with stolen money. I opened the message. "Hey Dad," the text read. "Having a really good business trip down here. The meetings are going great. Hope Lily is not being too annoying for you. We will be back to pick her up on Sunday afternoon." I stared at the glowing words. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. He was actively lying to me, pretending he was working hard on a business trip while he posted pictures of his VIP vacation on the internet. And he had the nerve to call the daughter he robbed annoying. A hot flash of absolute rage spiked in my chest, but I forced it down. I pushed it deep into my gut, converting that useless anger into cold, mechanical torque. A good mechanic never rushes the job. You have to let the engine run. You have to let the pressure build until the exact right moment. I placed my thumbs over the digital keyboard. I typed out a response that was perfectly calm, perfectly oblivious, and perfectly designed to keep him in the dark. "Glad the work is going well," I typed back. "Do not worry about a thing here. She is an absolute angel. Take your time." I hit send. I watched the little green bubble appear on the screen, confirming the message had gone through to his phone. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. Greg and Brenda were out there on the ocean, soaking up the sun and laughing at the world. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. They thought they had successfully manipulated an old man and discarded an unwanted child. But they had absolutely no idea that their entire lives were currently being dismantled by federal accountants in a downtown office building. They were sailing on the sinking ship, and I was the one who had quietly removed the lifeboats. All I had to do now was wait for Sunday to arrive. Sunday afternoon arrived with a slow and suffocating heat that seemed to press down on the entire neighborhood. I sat in the heavy wooden chair on my front porch, watching the quiet street with my hands resting flat on my denim jeans. For the past 48 hours, I had been living in a state of absolute hyper-awareness. I had secured my house. I had secured my granddaughter. I had set a federal trap with Evelyn Hayes that was just waiting to be sprung. Now all I had to do was wait for the monsters to come back from their luxury vacation. I watched the neighborhood birds hop across the front lawn searching for food in the grass. The peaceful normalcy of the afternoon felt entirely out of place compared to the absolute storm that was about to hit my driveway. Inside the house, Lily was safely occupied and completely unaware of the impending confrontation. I had set her up in the living room with a giant box of new crayons and a stack of fresh drawing paper. I told her I had some adult business to handle outside and that she was to stay inside the house no matter what she heard. I had locked the newly installed industrial deadbolts from the outside. Nobody was getting through that solid steel without my permission. At exactly 4:00, a sleek silver Mercedes turned the corner and slowly rolled down my street. The luxury car glided over the asphalt, its freshly washed paint gleaming under the bright afternoon sun. It pulled smoothly into my driveway, the expensive tires crunching softly against the gravel. I stood up from my wooden chair. My knees cracked from decades of hard labor, but my spine was perfectly straight. The driver's side door opened, and Greg stepped out into the heat. He was wearing a crisp white linen shirt, unbuttoned at the top, tailored beige resort shorts, and expensive leather loafers without socks. His skin was deeply tanned from a week of soaking up the Caribbean sun. He reached back into the car and grabbed a pair of high-end designer sunglasses, sliding them onto the top of his head with practiced, effortless arrogance. Brenda emerged from the passenger side a moment later. She wore a flowing, brightly colored resort dress that probably cost more than the first truck I ever owned. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she looked like a woman who did not have a single care or consequence in the entire world. In her hands, she carried 3 large, glossy shopping bags, heavily branded with the names of expensive tropical boutiques. They were completely overflowing with souvenirs, plastic toys, and designer clothes clearly meant for their biological son, Hunter, who was likely sitting comfortably in the air-conditioned back seat, playing on a tablet. There was not a single item in those glossy bags for the little girl they had abandoned in my care. Watching them walk up my driveway, parading the wealth they had actively stolen from an innocent child, made a cold, hard knot form in the very bottom of my stomach. They looked so completely relaxed. They looked so incredibly smug. They had no idea that their entire kingdom of lies was already burning to the ground. I stood at the very top of the porch steps, planting my heavy boots firmly on the wooden floorboards. I crossed my arms over my chest and watched them approach my home. They moved with the kind of lazy, entitled confidence that only belongs to people who believe they are completely untouchable. Brenda was busy looking down at her cell phone, scrolling through social media notifications with a bored expression on her face. Greg was looking at the front of my house, shaking his head slightly, as if he were silently judging the faded paint and the worn wooden siding. They did not see the new security cameras tucked discreetly under the eaves of the roof. They did not notice the heavy-duty strike plates I had drilled deep into the door frames. They were entirely blind to the fortress I had built right in front of their eyes. Greg finally looked up and gave me a lazy, half-hearted wave. He stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs, completely expecting me to turn around and fetch the daughter he considered a massive inconvenience. "Hey, Dad!" Greg called out, his voice dripping with false cheerfulness. "The business trip was a massive success. We got a lot of great networking done down in Florida. Go ahead and bring Lily out here. We are running a bit behind schedule, and we have a very important dinner reservation at the country club at 6. We need to get her home and out of our way so we can get changed." Brenda did not even bother to look up from her glowing screen. She just stood there, shifting her weight from one expensive shoe to the other, waiting for me to follow my son's orders like an obedient servant. They completely expected me to walk inside, grab the broken zipper backpack, hand over the traumatized 8-year-old girl, and wave goodbye, so they could go eat expensive steaks with their wealthy friends. I did not move a single muscle. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the stranger who used to be my boy. I did not step aside. I did not reach for the door handle. I just stared at him, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch out between us until the tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. Greg let out a loud, annoyed sigh. He dropped his hands to his hips and took a step up the wooden stairs. "Come on, old man," Greg said, his tone shifting rapidly from fake cheerfulness to open irritation. "Stop standing there like a statue. Bring her out. We do not have time to stand around and chat today. Hunter is tired of sitting in the car, and we need to get moving. Do not make this a whole big thing. Just go get the kid." I reached behind my back and rested my hand flat against the solid wood of my reinforced front door. I pulled it firmly toward me until I heard the heavy steel deadbolt click securely into place. The sound was loud and absolute. I was the only thing standing between them and the little girl they wanted to destroy. I was not going to move. Greg stopped on the second step. The sound of the deadbolt locking seemed to finally break through his thick layer of arrogance. He looked at my hand resting on the locked door, and then he looked up into my eyes. For the very first time since he pulled into my driveway, he noticed that something was terribly wrong. My face was not friendly. I was not offering the warm, welcoming smile of a grandfather. I was looking at him with the cold, calculating stare of a mechanic who was about to completely dismantle a ruined machine. "What are you doing, Dad?" Greg asked. His voice lost a fraction of its confidence, replaced by a sudden sharp edge of genuine confusion. "Why did you just lock the door? Unlock it and bring Lily out here right now." Brenda finally looked up from her phone. She sensed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. She lowered her glossy shopping bags to her side and took a step closer to her husband, her eyes darting nervously between Greg and me. I kept my arms crossed over my chest. I looked my son dead in the eye, stripping away every ounce of paternal warmth I had ever held for him. I wanted him to feel the full weight of the absolute disgust radiating from my soul. "How was the $27,000 suite, Greg?" I asked. My voice was incredibly low, but it carried across the quiet driveway like the crack of a heavy whip. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He froze entirely. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I took one slow, deliberate step down the porch stairs, closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a terrifying, deadly calm that demanded absolute attention. "I asked you a question, Greg," I continued, my eyes burning directly into his. "How was the luxury cruise? How was the VIP balcony? Did the expensive champagne taste better knowing that an abandoned 8-year-old orphan paid for every single drop of it?" Greg staggered backward as if I had forcefully shoved him in the chest. His deep tropical tan seemed to instantly wash away, leaving his face a sickly pale gray. He looked at Brenda, his eyes wide with sheer unadulterated panic. He tried to speak, but he only managed to choke on his own breath. He knew exactly what those words meant. He knew that I knew absolutely everything. There was no way to deny it. There was no excuse he could fabricate to explain away a $27,000 charge to a luxury cruise line. The fake story about a budget soccer tournament was completely dead. The illusion of his successful marketing firm was totally shattered. I stood above him on the porch, a silent, unmoving guardian of the truth. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in. I wanted him to realize that the father he thought he could easily manipulate had just become the architect of his total destruction. Brenda stared at me, her eyes stretched so wide the whites showed all the way around. The bored, arrogant expression she had worn just moments ago completely dissolved into a mask of pure terror. I watched her mind frantically race, trying to figure out exactly how I could possibly know the exact price of their luxury vacation. I watched her physically process the catastrophic failure of their entire scheme. Then the realization hit her. I saw the exact second her memory clicked into place. I saw her remember the hectic rush to leave for the airport on Friday afternoon. I saw her remember hastily grabbing a stack of highly sensitive legal and financial documents from her pristine marble kitchen counter. I saw her remember shoving that heavy manila envelope into the bottom of Lily's broken backpack just to get it out of sight. The color completely drained from Brenda's face. She looked like a woman who had just stepped off a tall ledge into an endless abyss. The envelope, Brenda gasped, her voice shrill and trembling with rising hysteria. The trust documents. Oh my God, Greg, the bank statements were in her bag. She dropped the glossy shopping bags directly onto the hard concrete of the driveway. Expensive souvenirs, plastic toys, and brightly colored resort clothes spilled out, scattering across the gravel like discarded trash. She did not even look at them. She let out a loud, piercing scream that echoed violently through the quiet suburban neighborhood. She lunged forward, pushing past her paralyzed husband, scrambling desperately up the wooden stairs of my front porch. She reached out with both hands, her manicured nails clawing frantically at the handle of my front door. She yanked on the brass handle with all her might, screaming at me to open the door, demanding that I give her back the backpack and the documents hidden inside. But the industrial steel deadbolt held perfectly firm. The door did not move a single millimeter. I stepped directly into her path, placing my large, heavy frame between her and the entrance to my home. I stood like a wall of solid, immovable steel. "Do not touch my door, Brenda," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that immediately stopped her frantic pulling. "You are not going inside my house. You are never going near that little girl ever again." She backed away from me, her chest heaving, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She turned to Greg, grabbing his arms and shaking him violently, begging him to do something, begging him to fix the catastrophic mistake she had made. But Greg was completely useless. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at me, with the terrified, hollow eyes of a cornered animal. He knew that the manila envelope contained everything. It contained the trust fund ledgers. It contained the fraudulent wire transfers. It contained the forged home equity line of credit that proved he had actively tried to steal his own father's house. The federal trap had fully snapped shut, and there was absolutely no escape. I looked down at the two of them shivering in the afternoon heat, completely stripped of their fake wealth and their arrogant pride. They had walked up my driveway expecting to simply collect their unwanted burden and drive off to a fancy dinner. Instead, they had walked headfirst into the total collapse of their lives. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a single drop of sorrow. I only felt the cold, righteous satisfaction of a man who was about to deliver absolute justice. Brenda stood on the hot concrete of my driveway and stared at the locked front door. Her chest was heaving up and down. The reality of what she had lost was finally sinking into her greedy mind. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her, and she knew it. The sheer panic in her eyes quickly mutated into a wild, uncontrollable rage. She began to stomp her expensive heels against the driveway. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and started screaming at the top of her lungs. She screamed that I had no right to lock her out of my house. She screamed that I was a crazy old man who had completely lost his mind and that I was stealing her child. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood on the porch with my hands resting quietly in the pockets of my denim jacket. My absolute silence only made her angrier. Brenda reached into her designer purse and pulled out her cell phone. Her hands were shaking so violently she almost dropped the device onto the gravel. "I am calling the police right now," she yelled at me, her voice shrill and echoing down the quiet suburban street. "I am going to tell them you kidnapped my daughter. I am going to tell them you locked us out and stole our child. You are going to rot in a jail cell for the rest of your pathetic life." She dialed the numbers and pressed the phone against her ear. I watched her entirely change her demeanor the exact second the emergency dispatcher answered the call. The angry, screaming woman completely vanished. In her place was a terrified, weeping mother. She forced loud, dramatic sobs from her throat. She cried into the receiver, telling the operator that her deranged father-in-law had stolen her 8-year-old daughter. She lied with absolute ease, claiming I had snatched the girl and locked myself outside the house to keep the parents away, and that she feared for her child's physical safety. It was a truly sickening performance. She was weaponizing the law, trying to use the police as her own personal heavy machinery to force my door open. Greg stood next to her, running his hands nervously over his slicked back hair. The deep tropical tan he had acquired on his luxury cruise seemed to be sweating right off his face. He looked at me, pleading with his eyes. He took a cautious step forward, holding his hands up as if he were trying to calm down a dangerous animal. "Dad, please," Greg said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "You do not understand what you are doing. If the police show up, this is going to be a massive public scandal. It will ruin my business reputation. Just open the door. Give us the backpack and the girl, and we will drive away right now. We will forget this ever happened. I can get you some money if you need it. We can work out a deal." I looked at the boy I had raised. He was actively trying to bribe me. He was trying to pay me off to ignore the fact that he was bleeding an orphan dry and trying to steal my home. I did not say a word to him. I did not even blink. I just planted my heavy boots on the wooden boards of the porch and waited. Inside my house, past the reinforced steel deadbolts, Lily was safe. She was sitting in a beautiful pink room drawing pictures and knowing she was finally home. No amount of money and no amount of screaming would ever make me move from this spot. The noise of Brenda's fake sobbing and loud screaming was starting to attract an audience. I saw the curtains twitch in the living room window of the Miller's house across the street. Old Mrs. Gable, who lived next door and spent her afternoons tending to her hydrangeas, stepped out onto her front lawn. She stood there holding her gardening shears, watching the wealthy, perfect couple absolutely lose their minds in my driveway. Brenda and Greg spent their entire lives obsessing over their public image. They wanted everyone to think they were rich, successful, and flawless. Now their pristine facade was cracking wide open in front of the entire neighborhood. 10 minutes later, the distinct wail of police sirens pierced the hot afternoon air. 2 large patrol cruisers turned the corner sharply, their blue and red lights flashing against the sides of the houses. They pulled up right in front of my driveway, blocking the street. 4 police officers stepped out of the vehicles. They moved quickly, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy-duty belts. They had received a call about a kidnapping in progress, and they were treating the situation with absolute seriousness. Brenda saw the uniform officers and immediately went into a complete frenzy. She ran toward them, tears streaming down her face, pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest. "He has her," Brenda wailed, grabbing the arm of the lead officer. "My crazy father-in-law locked my baby girl inside his house. He will not let us in. He stole her bag, and he is keeping her hostage. You have to break the door down. You have to arrest him right now before he hurts her. Please save my daughter." The lead officer was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression. He gently pulled his arm away from Brenda and motioned for his partner to keep her and Greg back near the street. The lead officer walked slowly up my driveway. He kept his eyes locked on me, assessing the threat. I knew exactly how I looked. I was a big, heavily built man with calloused hands and a weathered face standing rigidly on a porch like a guard dog. I did not make any sudden movements. I kept my hands clearly visible. I wanted the officer to know I respected his authority, but I also wanted him to know I was entirely in control of my property. "Good afternoon, officer," I said, keeping my voice deep and perfectly calm. "I apologize for the noise. There is no hostage situation here, and nobody is in any danger." The officer stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He looked at the heavy steel deadbolt on the front door and then back at me. "Sir, We received a frantic 911 call stating you have forcibly taken custody of a minor child against the parents, Will. The officer said, his tone commanding and serious. I need you to step away from the door. I need to see the child, and I need to hear your side of the story before things escalate any further. I nodded slowly. I understand you are just doing your job, sir, I replied. But that woman screaming on the sidewalk is lying to you. She is not a concerned mother. She is an agitated suspect. I reached slowly inside the deep inner pocket of my heavy denim jacket. I pulled out a thick, folded document. It was the emergency ex parte temporary custody order that Evelyn Hayes had secured for me just a few days ago. The thick paper was stamped with the official blue seal of the county family court and signed in bold black ink by the presiding judge. I walked down 2 steps and calmly handed the folded document directly to the police officer. The officer took the paper. He unfolded it and began to read. I stood quietly and watched his eyes scan the dense legal text. I watched him read the specific clauses detailing imminent financial abuse and supervisory neglect. I watched him examine the official judicial seal and the strict mandate granting me full immediate physical and legal custody of Lily. The tense, suspicious look on the officer's face completely vanished. His rigid posture relaxed. He folded the document back up and handed it respectfully back to me. He let out a slow breath and shook his head. Everything is in order here, Mr. Stovall, the officer said, his tone shifting from suspicion to professional respect. You have full legal authority to keep the child inside your home. Brenda heard the officer from the street. She broke away from the other policeman and ran back up the driveway. What are you talking about? Brenda screamed, her face contorted with rage. What did he just give you? That is my daughter. You have to arrest him. Break the door down. The lead officer turned around and faced Brenda. He stood between her and my porch, blocking her path entirely. Ma, you need to calm down and step back right now. The officer ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Nobody is breaking down any doors today, and nobody is arresting this man. He just provided me with a certified court-stamped emergency custody order signed by a family court judge. He has full legal temporary custody of the child. You have no legal rights to enter this property or demand the child be handed over. Greg's jaw dropped. He staggered backward, leaning heavily against the hood of his leased Mercedes. The blood completely left his face. He finally understood the absolute scale of the trap he had walked into. He realized that while he was drinking champagne on a luxury cruise ship, I had gone to the courts. I had secured a judge. I had legally stripped him of his parental rights. Brenda stopped screaming. The fake tears dried up instantly. She stared at the police officer in total paralyzing shock. The reality check had just been served, and it was a fatal blow to their entire operation. This is a civil matter now, the lead officer continued, staring hard at Greg and Brenda. The judge has made a ruling based on evidence of abuse. If you have an issue with this order, you need to take it up in a courtroom. But right now you are trespassing on this man's property. I am ordering you to leave the premises immediately. If you refuse to leave, or if you continue to create a public disturbance in this neighborhood, I will put both of you in handcuffs and take you to the county jail for trespassing and filing a false police report. Do you understand me? Brenda looked like she was going to faint. Her chest heaved and she opened her mouth to argue, but Greg rushed forward and grabbed her arm. For the first time in his life, my son realized he could not charm his way out of a situation. He could not lie or forge a signature to fix this. He was standing in a driveway surrounded by armed police officers and facing a father who had legally defeated him. "Shut up, Brenda," Greg hissed, his voice shaking with terror. "Just shut up and get in the car." They turned around and walked back down the driveway. The walk of shame was spectacular. They had to pick up their spilled luxury shopping bags and plastic souvenirs from the dirty concrete. They had to gather their expensive resort wear, while 4 police officers stood with their hands on their belts, watching their every move to make sure they complied. And the entire neighborhood watched them. Old Mrs. Gable stood on her lawn, shaking her head in disgust. The Millers watched from their window. The pristine, affluent image Greg and Brenda had spent years cultivating was completely destroyed in front of an audience. They were not a perfect, wealthy couple. They were 2 humiliated frauds being chased off a driveway by the police. They scrambled into their silver Mercedes. Greg slammed the car into reverse. He backed out of the driveway so fast the tires squealed against the asphalt. He threw the car into drive and sped down the street, fleeing the scene like a common criminal running from a robbery. The lead officer walked back over to my porch. He tipped his hat slightly. "Have a good evening, Mr. Stovall," the officer said. "Call us immediately if they try to come back. We will have a patrol car circle the neighborhood tonight just to be safe." I thanked the officers for their time and professionalism. I stood on the porch and watched the patrol cars pull away their lights, turning off as they merged back into the normal flow of traffic. The quiet, heavy peace of the Sunday afternoon returned to the street. The birds hopped back onto the lawn. The heat settled back over the neighborhood. I reached into my pocket and felt the rough edge of the court order. I turned around and unlocked the heavy steel deadbolt on my front door. I walked inside my house and locked the door firmly behind me. Lily was sitting in the living room, completely safe, coloring a picture of a yellow sun. I smiled at her, the cold mechanic fading away, allowing the loving grandfather to return. The first battle was won. The child was secure. The reality check had been delivered. But I knew the war was not over yet. Evelyn Hayes was about to drop the federal hammer, and I was going to be there to watch their entire fake empire turn to ash. The first few weeks after that Sunday showdown brought a kind of profound, quiet peace to my house that I had not felt since my wife passed away. The heavy, anxious tension that used to follow Lily around like a dark, suffocating cloud was completely gone. She was blossoming right in front of my very eyes. It is truly amazing what a little bit of physical safety and a massive amount of unconditional love can do for a broken child. When she first arrived at my house, she was silent and withdrawn. She picked at her food and walked around the rooms as if she were desperately trying to be invisible. She would flinch whenever a door closed too loudly. But now she was eating full, hearty meals. I cooked her large breakfasts of scrambled eggs and crispy bacon every single morning, and she ate every single bite with a smile. The pale, sickly color was finally leaving her face, and a warm, healthy glow was returning to her cheeks. She was putting on some much-needed weight. Her old, stained clothes that Brenda had shoved into that broken zipper backpack were sitting at the bottom of the county landfill. Lily now wore bright, clean outfits that actually fit her small frame perfectly. Every afternoon when she came home from elementary school, she would sit at the kitchen table and draw me beautiful pictures with her new crayons while I prepared our dinner. She started humming soft little tunes to herself while she colored. I would stand by the hot stove, stirring a pot of soup and listening to that sweet, innocent sound. I would feel my chest swell with an absolute fierce pride. I was doing exactly what a real father should have done in the very first place. I was protecting my blood. I was giving this little girl the safe, happy childhood she had been cruelly robbed of for 4 long years. But I knew people like Brenda and Greg did not just roll over and accept a legal defeat. They were desperate cornered rats, and cornered rats will always try to bite. I found out exactly how low my daughter-in-law was willing to sink on a cool Tuesday morning. I had just dropped Lily off at school and returned home to do some routine yard work. I was sweeping the fallen leaves off my front porch when a plain white four-door sedan pulled up to my curb. Two people got out of the vehicle. One was a middle-aged woman holding a thick plastic clipboard, and the other was a fully uniformed city police officer. My defensive mechanic instincts flared up instantly. I set the wooden broom against the brick wall of my house and walked down the porch steps to meet them halfway down the driveway. The woman introduced herself as an active field agent with Adult Protective Services. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of condescending pity and strict governmental authority. She told me they had received a very serious anonymous emergency report regarding my mental and physical health. My brow furrowed in total confusion. I asked her exactly what she was talking about. She read directly from the papers on her clipboard. The report stated that I was suffering from severe and rapidly advancing dementia. It claimed that I was prone to sudden, violent physical outbursts. It stated that I was experiencing dangerous paranoid delusions and that I was completely unfit to care for myself, let alone an 8-year-old child. The official report alleged that I had locked a terrified little girl inside my home during a manic psychotic episode and refused to let her rightful loving parents take her back. I stood there on the hard concrete of my driveway and felt a cold, sickening wave of realization wash over my entire body. Brenda had filed this completely fabricated report. She knew the family court judge had legally stripped them of their temporary custody. She knew she and Greg had zero legal standing to ever enter my home again. So she decided to play the dirtiest card she had left in her deck. She was actively trying to weaponize the state government against me. She was trying to paint me as a crazy, violent old man who was an active danger to society. If she could prove I was mentally unfit, the state would intervene and take Lily away from me. The state would put Lily right back into the hands of the very monsters who were currently draining her massive trust fund to pay for luxury cruises. It was a vicious, meticulously calculated, and incredibly evil smear campaign. The field agent told me that due to the extreme severity of the allegations, I had to comply with a mandatory welfare check and submit to a full, exhaustive psychological and physical medical evaluation. If I refused to cooperate, they would immediately obtain a court order and place Lily in emergency foster care by the end of the day. I looked at the police officer who had his hand resting cautiously on his heavy leather duty belt. I knew exactly what Brenda was hoping for. She was praying that the proud, stubborn old mechanic would completely lose his temper. She was hoping I would yell and curse and physically resist the officers to prove her vicious lies right. But I did not give them a single inch of satisfaction. I kept my breathing steady and my voice perfectly calm. I told the field agent I would willingly comply with every single test they wanted to run right that very minute. The next 48 hours were the most humiliating and invasive days of my entire life. I was forced to sit in brightly lit, sterile, white clinic rooms, while various doctors and state psychologists asked me incredibly degrading questions. They asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. They asked me to draw the face of a clock on a blank piece of paper and point the hands to 10 past 11. They asked me what city I lived in and who the president was. They looked me in the eye and asked me if I ever heard imaginary voices or forgot where I was living. They tested my physical reflexes, my vision, my hearing, and my short-term memory. Every single question felt like a direct insult to my personal dignity. I had spent over 40 years of my life building and repairing highly complex diesel engines. I had managed intricate structural blueprints and calibrated high-pressure fuel systems with absolute precision. My mind was sharper than a brand-new razor blade. To sit in a small plastic chair and be spoken to like a helpless, confused toddler made my blood boil with intense fury. But I swallowed my pride completely. I answered every single question clearly, politely, and accurately. I maintained absolute quiet dignity through the entire agonizing process. I knew exactly what was at stake. I knew that if I showed even a fraction of the deep rage burning inside my chest, the doctors would write it down as a violent, uncontrollable tendency. I let the medical professionals poke and prod my body. I let them test my memory recall. I let them review my full, extensive medical history. I passed every single test with absolute, flawless perfection. My cognitive brain functions were in the top percentile for a man of my age. My physical health was declared outstanding. The lead state psychologist who personally evaluated me even smiled and told me he wished he had my level of mental retention. He wrote a glowing official report declaring me entirely sound of mind, completely independent, and perfectly capable of providing a safe, nurturing environment for a minor child. I walked out of that state medical clinic with certified, legally binding proof that Brenda Thorne was a desperate, malicious liar. But I was not just going to hand that medical proof to the state agency and go home to rest. I was going to take it directly to the Shark on Gay Street. I drove my truck straight into downtown Knoxville and walked directly into Evelyn Hayes' law office. I bypassed the receptionist and dropped the thick stack of certified medical and psychological evaluations right onto Evelyn's polished mahogany desk. I sat down heavily in the leather chair and told her exactly what Brenda had tried to do. I told her about the police officer showing up at my house unannounced. I told her about the humiliating memory tests and the absurd questions. I told her that my own daughter-in-law had tried to use Adult Protective Services to steal my granddaughter back by having me declared legally insane. Evelyn read the detailed medical reports in total silence. Her face remained perfectly still, but I could see the familiar, dangerous spark of predatory excitement light up in her sharp gray eyes. "Frank," she said, keeping her voice incredibly low and steady. "This is the exact kind of desperate, sloppy, catastrophic mistake I was hoping they would make. When arrogant people like your son and his wife are backed into a corner, they always overplay their hand. Brenda thought she was being clever today. She thought she could use a bureaucratic state loophole to bypass the strict family court judge who took her custody away. But what she actually did was hand us the final permanent nail for her own legal coffin." Evelyn turned to her computer monitors and began typing rapidly. She explained to me that filing a false report with Adult Protective Services is a very serious criminal offense. But Brenda did not just make an anonymous phone call. To trigger a police response and an immediate medical hold, Brenda had to sign a sworn legal affidavit to initiate the investigation. She lied under penalty of perjury. Evelyn looked across the desk at me. Her expression was absolute freezing ice. "I am taking these perfect medical evaluations straight to the family court judge who granted your emergency custody," Evelyn told me. "I am going to show the court exactly what Brenda just attempted to do. I am going to file formal criminal charges of perjury and malicious prosecution against her. She actively tried to defraud the state government to circumvent a direct judicial order. The family court judge is going to be absolutely furious. And when the federal authorities review this updated file, they will see a crystal clear documented pattern of highly deceptive and fraudulent behavior. Brenda just proved to the entire government that she is a compulsive, dangerous liar who will stop at nothing to get her hands back on that child's massive trust fund." I felt a deep, immense wave of pure satisfaction wash over my tired soul. Brenda had tried to completely smear my good name. She had tried to paint me as a broken, useless old man who was losing his mind. She had tried to humiliate me in front of my entire neighborhood. But all she had actually done was wrap the legal noose much tighter around her own neck. Evelyn printed out a fresh stack of heavy legal filings and promised me that the massive hammer was going to drop very soon. The federal financial trap was completely set. The forensic accounting of the stolen $27,000 cruise and the forged home equity loan was completely verified. The new perjury and malicious prosecution charges were fully drafted. The entire explosive package was finally ready to be detonated. I left the downtown office and drove my truck back to Maple Ridge. When I pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun was shining brightly over the roof of my secure home. I walked through my reinforced front door and locked the heavy steel deadbolt securely behind me. The incredibly sweet smell of baking sugar cookies completely filled the house. I walked into the warm kitchen and saw Lily standing on a small wooden step stool next to the counter. She was happily helping my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, cut out star shapes from a fresh sheet of cookie dough. When Lily saw me walk into the room, her face lit up with a massive, brilliant smile. She dropped the plastic cookie cutter on the counter and ran across the kitchen floor, throwing her little arms tightly around my waist. She squeezed me as hard as she could and told me she missed me today. I knelt down on the linoleum floor and wrapped my big arms around her. I felt the steady, strong beat of her heart against my chest. I looked at her bright brown eyes and her incredibly happy, smiling face. She was completely unaware of the vicious, ugly legal wars being fought over her future. She did not know anything about the stolen trust fund, or the federal wire fraud, or the fake dementia reports Brenda had filed. All she knew in this entire world was that she was finally safe. All she knew was that she was finally unconditionally loved. I held her close and promised her we were going to eat warm sugar cookies until our stomachs hurt. I stood up slowly and looked out the kitchen window at the quiet street. The massive storm was coming for Greg and Brenda. They had tried to break me. They had tried to steal my home and rob my granddaughter of her future. They had tried to completely strip away my sanity and my freedom, but they had completely failed. They were going to lose absolutely everything they had ever cared about. Their money, their fake reputation, and their freedom were all about to vanish. And I was going to be standing right here holding this little girl's hand when the entire world found out exactly what kind of monsters they truly were. The 3 weeks following the showdown in my driveway felt like the calm before a massive, unavoidable hurricane. I spent every single hour of those 21 days focusing entirely on Lily, making sure she knew she was the most important person in my world. The heavy, fearful tension that used to drag her down was completely gone. She was eating full meals and drawing beautiful pictures at the kitchen table while I cooked dinner. She was finally safe. But while our home was filled with quiet peace, the gears of absolute destruction were turning downtown. Evelyn Hayes and her forensic accountant had mapped every single fraudulent transaction. The emergency custody order was absolute. Now it was time for the formal legal deposition. It was time to lock Greg and Brenda inside a room and let them bury themselves on the official public record. I woke up early that Thursday morning and put on my dark suit. I drove into downtown Knoxville and walked into Evelyn's large conference room. The long mahogany table was polished like a mirror. A court reporter sat in the corner setting up a stenography machine and a small video camera on a tripod. The room was freezing cold. Evelyn sat at the head of the table organizing a massive stack of manila folders. She looked up at me and gave a single sharp nod. The trap was fully set. At exactly 10 in this morning, the heavy oak doors swung open. Greg walked into the room with Brenda right behind him. They were accompanied by a man wearing an incredibly expensive silver suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. This was their high-priced defense attorney. Greg and Brenda looked completely smug. The sheer arrogant confidence rolling off them was almost suffocating. They genuinely believed this was just a minor inconvenience. They thought this was a simple family dispute over temporary custody, and that their slick lawyer was going to fast-talk his way through the proceedings and force me to hand Lily back over to them. They took their seats on the opposite side of the table. Greg leaned back in his expensive leather chair and crossed his arms, looking at me with a condescending smirk. Brenda pulled out her phone and placed it on the table, looking entirely bored. They had no idea they were walking into a slaughterhouse. The slick defense lawyer introduced himself and immediately tried to control the room. He spoke with a smooth, oily voice, telling Evelyn that his clients were very busy people and that we needed to resolve this little misunderstanding quickly. He stated that taking Lily away from her loving parents was a traumatic mistake, and that Greg and Brenda were fully prepared to forgive my temporary lapse in judgment if I dropped the custody petition right now. Evelyn did not even blink. She completely ignored the lawyer's arrogant speech and looked directly at the court reporter. She asked the reporter to turn on the camera and swear the witnesses in. Greg and Brenda raised their right hands and swore under oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That oath was the legal trigger we needed. The moment they said those words, they were legally bound to the public record. Any lie they told from that second forward was a documented felony. Evelyn began the deposition with a calm, clinical tone. She did not raise her voice. She started by asking Brenda basic questions about her upscale clothing boutique and her general financial stability. Brenda smiled a fake, rehearsed smile and answered confidently. She claimed her business was booming and that she and Greg were incredibly financially secure. She painted a picture of absolute upper-middle-class perfection. Evelyn let her talk. She let Brenda build her tower of lies as high as she wanted. Then Evelyn gently shifted the topic to the irrevocable trust fund left by Lily's biological grandmother. Evelyn asked Brenda directly if she or her husband had ever withdrawn any funds from that protected account for their own personal use. Brenda let out a soft, condescending laugh. She looked right into the camera lens and stated clearly that she had never touched a single penny of that money. She swore under oath that the trust fund was completely intact and resting safely in the bank, waiting for Lily to go to college. I sat next to Evelyn, keeping my face completely blank. My hands were resting flat on the mahogany table. I watched my daughter-in-law effortlessly commit perjury without a single drop of sweat on her forehead. She was a natural-born liar. Evelyn nodded slowly, pretending to accept the answer. Then she turned her sharp gray eyes toward my son. She asked Greg about his marketing firm. Greg puffed out his chest and bragged about his massive success, claiming he was bringing in huge national clients. Evelyn let him stroke his own ego for a few minutes before she dropped the next question. She asked Greg about the home equity line of credit taken out against my property in Maple Ridge 6 months ago. She asked him directly if he had forged his father's signature to secure a $350,000 loan. Greg's fake smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but his supreme arrogance quickly took over. He leaned forward and told Evelyn that the loan was a joint business venture. He swore under the penalty of perjury that I had willingly signed the paperwork to help him expand his company. He looked directly at me across the table and lied straight to my face. He claimed I went to the bank with him and happily put my house up as collateral because I believed in his business so much. His expensive lawyer nodded along, looking incredibly pleased with his client's smooth answers. They thought they had outsmarted us. They thought it was just my word against theirs, and they assumed the legal system would side with the wealthy, successful young couple over the retired diesel mechanic. They had officially dug their own graves, and they were happily standing right at the bottom. Evelyn Hayes stopped taking notes. She set her silver pen down on the table. The soft clicking of the court reporter's machine stopped. The silence in the conference room became absolute freezing ice. Evelyn looked at the defense attorney, and then she looked at Greg and Brenda. The time for playing along was completely over. The shark was finally going to show her teeth. Evelyn reached into her thick stack of manila folders and pulled out the forensic accountant's report. She slid the first document across the polished mahogany table directly in front of Greg's slick lawyer. She did not ask another question. She simply started reading the facts into the official public record. She read the exact dates, times, and amounts of every single fraudulent wire transfer pulled from Lily's trust fund. She read the bank routing numbers showing the money flowing directly from the orphan child's account straight into Greg and Brenda's joint personal checking account. Brenda stopped smiling. She stared at the paper sitting in front of her lawyer, and all the color completely drained from her face. Evelyn did not stop. She pulled out the next document and slid it across the table. It was the commercial lease ledger for Brenda's boutique, showing 6 months of unpaid rent, followed by sudden massive cash injections that perfectly matched the stolen trust fund withdrawals. She pulled out another document showing the IP logs from the bank. The internet protocol addresses proved that the transfers were executed from the wireless network located inside Greg and Brenda's own house. Evelyn then pulled out the forensic handwriting analysis of the home equity loan. She read the conclusion from the state-certified expert, declaring with absolute scientific certainty that the signature on the bank documents was a complete and total forgery executed by Greg Thorne. Greg gripped the armrests of his leather chair so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a speeding freight train. His expensive defense lawyer was frantically reading the documents, his eyes wide behind his glasses. The smooth, confident attorney suddenly realized his clients had lied to him. He realized he was sitting in a room with 2 people who had just committed massive documented perjury on camera. The lawyer started sweating. He held up his hand and tried to stutter out an objection, claiming his clients needed to invoke their right to remain silent. But it was way too late for silence. Evelyn pulled out the final piece of paper. It was the billing receipt from Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines. She read the total amount into the record, $27,000. She read the routing number used to pay the cruise line, proving it was the exact same account where the stolen trust fund money had been deposited just 2 days prior. She looked at Brenda and calmly asked her how she could afford a luxury vacation when her business was facing 3 separate civil lawsuits for unpaid inventory. She asked Greg how he could claim the home equity loan was a joint venture when the forensic evidence proved he forged the documents from his own computer while his father was working a shift at the diesel repair shop. The room was completely quiet, except for the ragged, panicked breathing coming from my son and his wife. They were totally trapped. The evidence was absolute and undeniable. Every single lie they had just sworn to under oath was completely destroyed by cold, hard forensic facts. Brenda put her hands over her face and started to cry. But these were not the fake dramatic tears she used on the police in my driveway. These were real, desperate tears of a woman who finally understood her life was entirely over. Greg just stared at the mahogany table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at his lawyer begging for a way out, but the lawyer had pushed his chair away from the table, physically distancing himself from the toxic, radioactive mess his clients had created. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I placed my hands flat on the table and leaned forward. The wood was cold against my palms. I looked directly at the boy I had raised. I looked at the man who was willing to destroy my life and steal from an innocent child just so he could drink expensive champagne on a private balcony. I did not feel any anger anymore. I only felt a cold, heavy resolve. "You thought you were so smart, Greg," I said, my voice low and steady. "You thought you could treat Lily like a burden and use her money as your personal piggy bank. You thought you could steal the house your mother and I built with our bare hands, and leave me completely homeless in my old age. You thought you could just lie your way out of it because you always thought you were better than everyone else." Greg looked up at me, his eyes filled with pure terror. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, we can fix this. I will pay the money back. I will sell the cars. I will do whatever you want. Please do not take this to the family court judge. If we get a criminal record, we will lose everything." I shook my head slowly. "The time for fixing things passed the second you dropped that little girl off with a broken backpack and a head full of trauma," I told him. "And you are deeply mistaken about what is happening here today." I let the silence hang in the freezing air of the conference room. I wanted them to feel the absolute dread pooling in their stomachs. "You think Evelyn was just building a case for family court?" I asked him, watching his face closely. "You think we gathered all this forensic banking evidence across state lines just to get permanent custody of Lily? You wired $27,000 of stolen money from a protected trust fund across state borders to a port in Florida. You forged federal banking documents to secure a fraudulent loan." Brenda stopped crying and looked at me, her makeup running down her pale cheeks. She did not understand what I was saying, but Greg understood. I saw the exact moment the final devastating reality crushed his spirit entirely. "We did not just build a custody case," I told them, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Evelyn built a federal indictment. We handed this entire airtight dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS 3 weeks ago. They have been quietly monitoring your accounts ever since. They just needed you to sit in this room and commit perjury on the official record to seal the final charges." The slick defense lawyer immediately stood up, packing his briefcase with frantic, shaking hands. He knew a federal trap when he saw one, and he knew his clients were completely doomed. He told Greg he could no longer represent him, and practically ran out of the heavy wooden doors. Greg and Brenda were left completely alone, sitting in the ruins of their shattered lives. Greg started sobbing heavily, burying his face in his hands. He begged me to stop it. He pleaded with me to call the authorities off. He cried that he was my son and that I could not do this to him. I felt absolutely nothing for him. He was a broken machine, and I was finally throwing him in the scrap pile. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked at the two monsters sitting across from me. I pointed my finger toward the large floor-to-ceiling windows covering the far wall of the conference room. The windows looked directly down onto the busy downtown street below. "I cannot call them off, Greg," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "The wheels are already turning. If you do not believe me, I suggest you stand up and look out the window." Greg slowly lifted his head from his hands. He pushed his chair back and walked on trembling legs toward the massive glass window. Brenda followed him, her whole body shaking violently. They looked down at the street. Pulling up directly in front of the brick office building were 3 dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles. The doors opened, and 5 men wearing dark suits and tactical vests with bright yellow letters printed on the back stepped out onto the sidewalk. They were federal agents. They were walking into the building, and they were coming straight up to the 4th floor. Greg pressed his hands against the glass, staring down at his own inescapable doom. He knew he was never going back to his luxury condo. He knew he was never going to drive his leased Mercedes again. He was going to leave this building in handcuffs, and he was going to lose absolutely everything. I sat at the mahogany table and watched them panic. I had protected my granddaughter. I had protected my home. The engine of justice was running perfectly, and I had successfully dismantled their lives down to the very studs. The afternoon sun beat down through the large glass window of the conference room. I pointed my finger toward the street below and watched my son and his wife stare down at their absolute doom. 3 dark sport utility vehicles were parked aggressively against the curb. 5 federal agents wearing dark suits and heavy tactical vests stepped out and walked straight into the lobby of the building. Greg pressed his trembling hands against the thick glass. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. Brenda was completely frozen. Her expensive resort dress suddenly looked ridiculous on her shaking frame. She turned away from the window and looked at me with wild, terrified eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just let out a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. The heavy oak door of Evelyn Hayes' conference room swung open with a loud thud. The slick defense attorney had already vanished, leaving his guilty clients completely alone to face the music. 2 federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation walked into the room, followed closely by a local plainclothes detective. The agents moved with absolute rigid authority. They did not shout, and they did not draw their weapons. They simply walked directly up to Greg and Brenda and asked them to confirm their identities. Greg tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He nodded his head slowly. The lead agent did not waste a single second. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and told Greg to place his hands behind his back. He read Greg his rights in a flat, mechanical voice, detailing the massive list of charges: federal wire fraud, grand theft, aggravated identity theft, elder abuse. The words hung in the freezing air of the conference room like a death sentence. Greg did not resist. He let the agent pull his arms back and lock the cold metal around his wrists. The clicking sound of the handcuffs echoing in that silent room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Brenda completely lost her mind. When the second federal agent stepped toward her, holding his own set of handcuffs, she backed away and bumped hard into the mahogany table. She started screaming that it was all a terrible mistake. She cried that she was a mother and that she had a successful business and that she did not belong in jail. The agent calmly told her to stop resisting, or she would face additional charges. He grabbed her wrists gently but firmly and locked the steel cuffs in place. Her glossy shopping bags full of expensive tropical souvenirs were still sitting on the floor, forgotten and useless. She looked over her shoulder at me with tears ruining her perfect makeup. She begged me to tell them to stop. She begged me to tell the agents that it was just a family misunderstanding. I sat in my leather chair and looked right through her. I told her that she should have thought about her family before she stole an orphan's future to buy designer shoes. I told her she should have thought about her family before she filed a false medical report to have me declared insane. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the woman crying in front of me. I felt the deep, righteous satisfaction of a father protecting his own. The agents escorted Greg and Brenda out of the conference room. They walked them down the long hallway toward the elevators. I stood up and walked to the doorway, watching them take their final steps as free citizens. They were going to be paraded through the downtown lobby in front of dozens of people. They were going to be thrown into the back of a federal vehicle and processed into the county jail. The flawless, wealthy image they had spent years building was dead and buried. Evelyn Hayes stood next to me and crossed her arms. She looked at the empty hallway and gave a small, satisfied nod. She told me the trap worked perfectly and that they would not be seeing the outside of a prison cell for a very long time. 6 months passed since that morning in Evelyn's office. The wheels of federal justice turn incredibly slow, but they grind everything to absolute dust. Greg and Brenda did not even try to fight the charges. The forensic evidence Evelyn and her accountant had gathered was far too absolute. The bank routing numbers, the forged signature analysis, and the internet protocol logs from their own home computer painted a flawless picture of calculated malicious theft. They took a plea deal to avoid a massive public trial, but the federal judge showed them absolutely no mercy. I sat in the back of the federal courtroom on the day of their sentencing. The judge was a stern man who looked at my son with total disgust. He told Greg and Brenda that their crimes were some of the most despicable acts of greed he had ever seen from parents. He sentenced both of them to 10 years in federal prison for the financial crimes against a minor and the elder abuse charges related to my forged home equity loan. They were ordered to pay full restitution to the trust fund and to my estate. I watched the bailiffs lead them away in matching orange jumpsuits. Greg looked back at me one last time, but I did not offer him a single glance of forgiveness. He was just a stranger who had tried to ruin my life. Their absolute financial ruin followed immediately after the sentencing. Because they owed massive federal restitution, the government seized absolutely everything they owned. Brenda's failing upscale clothing boutique was permanently boarded up, and the commercial landlord seized all her remaining inventory to cover her unpaid rent. Greg's marketing firm filed for total bankruptcy and dissolved overnight. The bank foreclosed on their massive luxury house in the wealthy suburbs. I drove past their old neighborhood once just to see it with my own eyes. There was a large wooden foreclosure sign pounded into their perfectly manicured front lawn. The bank had also repossessed their leased luxury vehicles. The silver Mercedes they had driven to my house on that fateful Sunday was gone forever. The hardest part of the entire fallout was dealing with their biological son, Hunter. He was an innocent boy who had been completely spoiled and corrupted by his parents' terrible values. Because Greg and Brenda were going to federal prison for a decade, Hunter had to be placed with family. Brenda's older sister, who lived 3 states away in Ohio, agreed to take him in. I watched them load his bags into her car. He was crying because he did not understand why his perfect, wealthy life had suddenly vanished. I felt a brief pang of sorrow for the boy, but I knew he was better off far away from the toxic influence of his parents. He would have to learn how to live a normal, humble life without $27,000 vacations and designer clothes. While their world burned to ashes, my world was slowly filling with beautiful, warm light. The dark storm had finally passed, and the sky above Maple Ridge was clear. The scene shifts to a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon in late spring. The air was warm and smelled like fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers. I was sitting on my front porch in my favorite heavy wooden chair, drinking a cup of hot, black coffee. The morning had been the absolute best day of my entire life. I had walked into the local family court building wearing my best dark suit, holding Lily's small hand in mine. We stood in front of the same silver-haired judge who had granted my emergency custody order 6 months ago. She looked down at us from her high wooden bench and gave us a warm, genuine smile. She signed the final permanent legal documents terminating Greg and Brenda's parental rights entirely. With the stroke of her heavy black pen, she officially granted me permanent full adoption rights over Lily. She was no longer my abandoned granddaughter. In the eyes of the law and in the eyes of God, she was my own daughter. Evelyn Hayes had also delivered a flawless victory on the financial front. She and her team of forensic accountants worked tirelessly with the federal authorities to untangle the massive mess Greg had made. They successfully proved that my signature on the home equity line of credit was a total forgery. The bank was forced to completely void the $350,000 loan and remove the lien against my property. My house was safe. The home my late wife and I had built with our bare hands was secure once again. Even better, Evelyn managed to recover every single stolen penny from Greg and Brenda's liquidated assets. The government seized their bank accounts, sold off their remaining property, and forced the sale of Brenda's boutique fixtures. The entire $450,000 trust fund was completely restored. The judge placed the recovered money into a highly secure, heavily protected trust account managed by a neutral third-party state trustee. Nobody could touch that money ever again until Lily turned 18 years old. Her future was entirely secure. She would be able to go to any college she wanted, and she would never have to worry about a roof over her head. The final gift from her biological grandmother had been saved. I sat on the porch and took a slow, deep breath of the fresh spring air. I watched Lily running across the green grass of the front lawn. She was wearing a pair of bright pink overalls and the light-up sneakers I had bought her on her first day here. She was chasing a yellow butterfly, laughing a bright musical sound that completely filled the quiet neighborhood. She looked so incredibly healthy and vibrant. Her cheeks were full and rosy, and her dark hair bounced around her shoulders. She was no longer the silent, terrified little girl clutching a broken zipper backpack. She was a confident, happy child who knew she was unconditionally loved. She stopped running for a second and looked back at me sitting on the porch. She raised her hand and waved a massive, bright smile spreading across her face. "Look at the butterfly, Dad," she yelled happily. "Dad!" The word hit my chest like a warm, heavy blanket. It was the very first time she had ever called me that. She had always called me Grandpa, but today, after the judge signed the final papers, something inside her had shifted. She finally understood that I was never going to leave her. She finally understood that I was her real father now. I smiled back at her and waved my hand, feeling a hot tear slowly slide down my weathered cheek. I wiped the tear away and leaned back in my wooden chair. I thought a lot about the strange, heavy concept of karma. Karma is not just a mystical idea. It is a slow, relentless machine that constantly measures the weight of your actions. Greg and Brenda thought they could cheat the machine. They thought their greed and their arrogance could outrun the consequences of their cruelty. They believed that wealth and a fake social image would protect them from the damage they inflicted on an innocent orphan and an old man. But karma is incredibly patient. It let them build their paper castle as high as the clouds, just so the fall would utterly destroy them. Greed and cruelty will always eventually swallow you whole. They leave you alone, sitting in a concrete cell with absolutely nothing to your name. But a foundation built on honest love and sacrifice will withstand any storm the world throws at you. I had spent 40 years breaking my back in diesel repair shops just to provide for my family. I had given everything I had to build a safe, warm home. And when the ultimate test arrived, when my own flesh and blood tried to tear that home down, I stood my ground. I protected the innocent. I fought back with the quiet, unyielding torque of a mechanic who knows how to fix what is broken. And because I stood firm, my house was now filled with the sound of a little girl's laughter. Karma is a patient collector, but it always demands its due. If you stand by the innocent, you will never fight alone. Did you feel the righteous justice in this story? Tell me in the comments which city are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of justice served. With love and respect, I will see you in the next one.